We'll talk about engaging and directly communicating with our people and some ways that we can move our teams forward. All right, so we're going to start at the beginning, and every solid team has a strong strategy, right? And when we're thinking about communication, we go to what I call the 3 C's of team communication. And that is content, which is what we say, channels, which is how we share that information, and then cadence, which is how often we are communicating with our people. The 3 C's are really important when we are communicating. So here's another poll. How often are you communicating with your volunteers? And again, we've got some different choices for you. We have ranging from every day to quarterly. And then we also have an option that is other. And if you choose other, please use the chat. Let us all know what that looks like for you. I think we can learn so much from each other as we find out what everybody's doing. And you may be using a combination of this as well, but just choose the one that seems most clear to you. I see the numbers flying across the screen, and it looks like about 60% of us are communicating weekly and or monthly, which is really great to see. I'm going to go ahead and share the results with you so that you can see them. Can everybody see that? Okay, so 7% of us are communicating every day, which is terrific. That's fantastic. About a third of us communicate weekly, another third are communicating monthly. And then about 9% of us communicate on a quarterly basis, and 17% of us are doing something else. Melissa, did anybody happen to say what else they're doing?
Amanda says, her cadence for communication just depends on how volunteers are assigned to cases or, just
Sure.
waiting. She's, I believe, with a CASA. Yep. And then Rachel says the same thing. Caitlin says, I'm just starting the whole process of managing volunteers for 2022. So she hasn't started yet.
Okay.
And Ruby says, they get information out as needed. So, I think it does depend, and it really does kind of reflect what was done here in the poll, what folks said in the poll. So that was great. And you know what, if you're just starting in volunteer management, which I think there were a couple comments about that too, that's totally okay. You got to start somewhere, right, Karen?
Definitely. And it's not just starting somewhere. It's really stepping back, taking a look at what you are doing, and there we go. Taking a look at what you're doing and knowing that it's okay to take it step by step. It's especially when you're starting out, to try and do everything at once can be overwhelming. So break it down, take it one step at a time, and you'll be in great shape. Something to think about when you are building a team or thinking about communicating with your team is the idea of scaling. And this question comes up a lot because every organization is different. There is no one size fits all to volunteer engagement or to communication. It depends on the size and the structure of your organization, as well as your volunteer program and the makeup of your volunteers. So when we think about scaling our communication, that means we can scale them up and do more or make them bigger. We can scale them down and make it appropriate for a smaller size group or organization. There is, as I mentioned, no one size fits all. And the best part about communication is it doesn't have to break the bank. In fact, many times we can do communication without spending any money at all or virtually very little resources. So something, it's important to think about. Communication has to happen. It's key and critical, and it impacts the bottom line in a very positive way, but it doesn't have to necessarily affect your budget in a huge way. You do need to have some kind of a budget for communication, but it depends on how you are communicating with your people. And speaking of people, so when we think about communicating, I always like to have my communication expert team on board. And we need to rely on our experts for a variety of reasons, Who am I talking about? Well, we have several different people. And first off is legal. Legal counsel is really important to us for a variety of reasons with our volunteer programs, but also from a communication perspective. We may need to communicate about issues that involve liability or legal concerns. And so we may need some counsel from legal for that reason. In terms of the next person on the list, your Marcom guru, this is your expert in everything and anything regarding communication. If you have to, let's say you're creating a newsletter or you're writing a piece for the newsletter and you don't consider yourself a writer, or you need someone to just look it over, maybe make a few edits, your Marcom guru would love to do that. So happy to help you with any of your communication needs, talking about channels, talk to them about cadence, whatever you need, they are there to support you. And a relationship with your Marcom guru is actually two-way, because not only does your Marcom guru have many tools and things that they can share with you, but you have something that will help your Marcom guru, and that is your volunteers. You can share success stories. You can share the results of and the outcomes from your volunteers and the work that they are doing. This is gold to your marketing communications folks, because they in turn share this information with the outside world. And so you can have a really wonderful working relationship with your Marcom guru. Next on the list is your IT wizard, IT. We are right now communicating over digital, right? We're on Zoom at the moment. Because of COVID, we found ourselves communicating virtually with our volunteers, and many of us are still in that situation. While some of us may be on site again with our volunteers, face-to-face, in person in the room, the majority of us are not, or we're in a hybrid situation where we've got some people remote and some people on site. Because of this, it's very important that we have our tech person on call, because as we all know, technology sometimes has glitches, and we need to make sure that we have the ability to communicate. So if you have any issues or concerns, that's the person that you go to. Now, all three of these people, I guarantee you that you have someone in your organization who has these responsibilities. Even if you are a small group or organization, there's someone that does this. And if you don't know who these folks are within your organization, I recommend that you find out and set up a call with each of them. Call your legal counsel and just have a quick chat, introduce yourself and say, hey, I'm Karen. I am the VEP, the Volunteer Engagement Professional, and I run the volunteer programs. And I just wanted to say hello. I may have some questions for you in the future and just wanted to touch base now. When you set the tone and you open the door for that relationship, that working relationship with any one of your experts, when you need them, you have a much quicker response and everybody's already at the table for you and with you. The other two people that are on this list, the executive connection, this is your champion. This is someone who sits at a higher level in your organization. It may be your executive director. It might be someone from management or leadership, depending on the type of organization you have, somebody from the board. This is someone who is willing to touch base with you, give you sort of that eagle's eye perspective on the bigger picture, and also who can help guide you and champion your program. Very, very important person to have on your team. And then lastly, let's not forget about our volunteers. Our skills-based volunteers, we have skills-based volunteers who have the capabilities to help with communication. This is why we ask questions and we do that intake interview, right? To learn more about our volunteers as they're coming in the door so that we can find somebody with these skill sets and tap them. They are more than happy to help in lots of different professional areas. So think about checking in with your volunteers and asking them for help if you need it. All that being said, we have a great team of experts now, right? But we can still have challenges. Communication challenges happen. What kind of challenges are you dealing with? Use the chat and let us know. You may be dealing with a team that has a preconceived notion of how they should communicate. And by that, I mean, maybe it's a long-standing team. going for years. And they say, well, we've always communicated this way and it seems to work for us. So we don't want to try anything new or make any changes. We might also have a situation where we have a new volunteer coming in who just isn't quite sure where he fits in and is maybe hesitant to raise a hand or make a mistake. So, these are communication concerns. We want our volunteers to be able to communicate with us and with the team. And we want to be able to try new things if we need to. Melissa, what kind of communication concerns are some of us having? What are we saying?
Yeah. So Isabel says the pandemic, it's been hard to contact students and their families for fruits and vegetables, taste tests. Yeah. And then Rachel says she's shifted her career from youth development to volunteer management, and she's having a hard time slowing down the pace for retirees. That's, huge. I mean, they're on a different schedule than working people a lot of time. And then we also have, she says, I speak quickly and energetically and I lose our team. I've had that same issue, I'll tell you.
What, that you speak too quickly?
I think so. Yes. Okay. Yeah. And then Kate says email versus phones phone calls for volunteers. Yeah. You know what? Let's start addressing these and then I'll get to the rest of them. Yeah.
Okay. So quick tip for if you speak too quickly or you feel that you do, try chewing your words. And by that, I mean, think about enunciating every syllable, every vowel and letter. When you do that, you automatically slow your brain down because you're thinking about saying each piece of the word, and it will slow you down and help. So that's answering one question. Regarding emails versus phone calls, yeah, so this comes up a lot. And it's very interesting because when we think about our volunteers, we have volunteers who are from different generations and we have generational preferences as well. So we need to find out who our volunteers are and how we can best communicate with them. Many of our volunteers are younger. Our volunteers from the younger generations tend to prefer technology, right? Our volunteers from the older generations are sometimes very tech savvy, but sometimes not so much. And I mean, I have organizations that I work with that want phone trees. They still want to have those phone calls. And if you have the bandwidth to do that, and that's the best way for you to reach your volunteers, then that's what you need to do. So it's really dependent on your organization. If you're looking to shift your volunteers from one thing to another, for example, from phone calls to emails, I would start by explaining to them why we would like to communicate with everybody over email instead of making phone calls, right? It's quicker, it's more efficient, and they have the ability to respond back. Whereas when we make a phone call, sometimes they're not home. We can only leave a message or a voicemail, and they may not have the chance to have the conversation they want. So, explain to them, and that will help begin that transition for them. But again, the technology, the capability has to be there for them to have access to email.
Absolutely. One of the things that Isabel said was that the pandemic presented some new communication challenges in terms of, it sounds like, reaching people.
Sure. Well, if you think about it, when the pandemic hit, first of all, aside from blindsiding us, we all found ourselves in different situations because suddenly everybody was locked down at home. And reaching people, people weren't in the office, people weren't always accessible, people were sharing technology. And so that became an issue. We also have the issue of accessibility and Wi-Fi. Not everybody lives in a place where they have good Wi-Fi. We have people who live in rural environments where Wi-Fi just wasn't happening for a while, or sometimes due to weather or whatever reasons, systems go down. So, we are dependent on the technology, and it definitely gives us challenges. And the pandemic I agree, put a whole nother layer on top of that.
Yeah, Caitlin
sure.
says that too. There's a lack of technology literacy in the UP. Also, Anna Jean says, she mentions how difficult it is to get feedback and responses. In this case, teachers and faculty. Well, I think that's across the board. And I know for myself, I'm one of those people. I think I'm so overwhelmed with being in front of a screen all day that the last thing I want to do is go open up my personal emails and cipher, sift through those. So I know I've had a few people that have said, hey, I emailed you on your, about that. And then I'm like, just send me a text. I mean, something just has to flag it for me.
Right. So we're actually going to get to feedback. We're going to be talking about that in a little bit. So if it's okay with you, let's move on.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we've just been talking about some different communication challenges, and these are important to think about and to be aware of, and also, of course, to address, because this is how we engage our people, right? Where does engagement start? Starts with you, starts with the team leader up at the top. So let's use the chat some more. Tell us how you define a strong leader. And while you're doing that, I'm going to share with you a few thoughts of my own. To me, one of the attributes of a strong leader is that she lets her people shine. Strong leaders delegate. Strong leaders offer opportunities, and they mentor, and they guide and motivate and inspire their people. Strong leaders also work to find the right fit of the volunteer to the role, and vice versa. Melissa, what's everybody else saying?
They have some great comments. Confident, assured, with wisdom, knowing all parts of the job, being inclusive. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yep. These are great. So true. And
listen to the team members. Oh, here's more. Giving the feedback, motivation, give credit to their team. That's awesome. Support each member's growth, being available. Yeah.
Right. And these are all things that we are going to be talking about, because these are all forms of communication. A strong team leader has to be an excellent communicator. And a lot of times we communicate without even realizing it, but it's very important that we are communicating with our people, with our teams, right? One of the ways to communicate is to start from day one. When I walk onto a new team or I'm building out a team, I have an individual one-on-one conversation with every one of my team members or prospective team members if I'm building out the team. And yeah, it takes a little bit of time, but this is a chance for me to get to know my team member, and my team member to get to know me and learn more about the team. It's a chance for me to share some information about the team, who we are, how we operate, how we communicate with each other, and a chance for me to learn about the volunteer, right? I ask questions like, why are you interested in being a part of this particular team? And where do you feel your strengths lie? And what do you think you bring to the table? These are important questions because they help us when we are placing people into roles. And this is all part of communication. It's very, very important that we're doing this. When we build out a team, and when we think about communicating to our team, communicators always start with A. A stands for audience. And so when we think about who is on our team, who is our audience, it is, of course, our people. This is where we get into that idea that we talked about with our volunteers being perhaps from different generations, having different communication preferences, and having some of those accessibility challenges perhaps that we need to take into account when we are communicating. Some of the things that our team members, they have questions too, right? When they join a team or they're thinking about joining a team, they want to know what it's going to be like. Questions they might ask: does everybody get along? How does everybody work together, right? Am I going to be challenged? How about this one? What's Karen like as a team leader? Do I really want to be on a team that is led by Karen? The team leader sets the tone for the team, and it's important to our people, to our volunteers on teams, who the team leader is. It's also important to them to have the opportunity to raise a hand and make a suggestion, or to offer comments, to suggest some innovative ideas. lots of things that we want to be sure we're offering those opportunities to our people. Really what we're doing, what our team members are trying to figure out is what's the culture of our team. And what do we mean by team culture? Well, culture is basically the dynamic between people. It's how we operate, how we work together, how we collaborate, how we communicate. And we can have different types of culture on our teams. We can have strong culture teams. And these, of course, are the teams to be on. Everybody wants to be on these teams because these are the teams where everybody is cohesive. Everybody's on the same page. They drive forward. They set the bar so high for themselves and they always reach over it every time. These teams succeed because they have open two-way communication, because they have confidence and trust in their teammates as well as in their team leader. And of course, they're mission driven, right? So they're focused on the impact they're making on the mission. These are amazing teams. And these are the teams that everybody is chomping at the bit to be involved with. On the flip side, we have teams that have a weak team culture. And these tend to be what we call permission-based, which means that team members feel almost as if they need to raise a hand to not just to ask a question, but to take a step or do an activity. And that's hard. It's hard because it's frustrating. It's hard because it's discouraging. And on teams like this, there's a lot of hoops that the volunteers have to jump through. And when that happens, people get discouraged and they want to pull back. And these are not the type of team cultures that we want to have on our teams or that we ever want to develop. We want strong team cultures. When we think about communicating to our teams and building out the culture with a remote team, we have some things to think about. So let's use the chat. And if you would share with us how you are remotely inspiring your people. So inspiring them in a remote or virtual way. And while you do that, I'm going to share a few thoughts of my own, and then we're going to hear what you have to say. Some of the things we need to think about when we are looking to motivate a remote team. Number one is accessibility. So we need to let our team members know that they can reach us, they can access us. We don't have the luxury of being in the room, knocking on the door and saying, hey, Karen, how's it going, right? We need to make those opportunities available to our people. So here's a suggestion. I like to have office hours. And I say it to my teams every morning on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 9 a.m. until 11. So 2 hours twice a week. I'm going to be in my Zoom room. Here's the link. And if you would like to pop in at any point in time during those timeframes, please do. We can have a chat. We can talk about whatever you'd like to talk about, or we can just catch up if you want. If you want to have a conversation that might be more private or that's a bit more specific, then let's get together with our calendars, find a day and time that works for both of us, and let's make it happen. So what I've done there is, number one, I've opened the door, right? I've told my team, hey, I'm here. I know that we have things to talk about, and here are the times when I'm available. Let's see if these work for you. By doing that, not only am I letting them know that I'm available to them, I'm letting them know that I value their time. And how do they know this? Because I'm giving them choice. I'm giving them 4 hours to see if they might be able to meet with me at any point during those 4 hours, as opposed to saying 8 o'clock Monday morning, let's have our conversation. Our volunteers have lives outside of our organizations, entire lives that have nothing to do with us. And we need to remember that. We need to understand that they have schedules they have to flex around. And so when we can offer a volunteer some options as far as scheduling goes, that's always a welcome thing. Something else we need to think about is having regular meetings, especially when we are remote. I mean, when we're remote, what does that mean? It means I'm here in Dallas. You all are in Michigan. We're all in separate places, and there's a barrier between us. And that barrier happens to be a camera or a computer screen or a device, right? We're not physically in the room, and that's totally okay. We can still have amazing conversations. We can still do incredible work. but we just have to approach it a little bit differently. And part of that means we need to meet, I think, more often, because our people need to not feel isolated, and they need to know that even when we don't see them, we're thinking about them. And how do they know that? Because we meet regularly. When we have a regular meeting, like a weekly team meeting, it's a chance for everybody to come together, talk about what's been happening, talk about where we're going, for the next week, and even do a personal share. I love starting meeting with a personal share, which is giving everybody 30 seconds, not a long time, 30 seconds, and having everybody say something. I don't know, maybe the topic is, what's the new series you're watching on Netflix? Or what book have you most recently read? Something simple, something that levels the playing field so everybody can answer it in one way or another. And it gives everybody a chance to actually talk. It's hard when we're in a room, as we know, and especially even more when we're remote. Some people are more hesitant to speak up. We have people who are extroverts who just are happy to jump in no matter what. And more introverted folks tend to hold back a little bit. So if we can encourage everybody to at least say hello, it goes a long way towards building those team bonds. Melissa, I'm curious to see what we are doing to inspiring our people. What are people saying?
Oh my gosh, they have all kinds of things
I'm
here.
sure they do.
Yeah, Rachel.
So what are we doing?
I have to say, she made handmade Valentines for that she's going to put in for her winter team. And then a lot of folks are doing things like they're encouraging check-ins on reports for injuries, surgery, happy birthday wishes to celebrate, and then also giving out your cell number, and they could reach that person anytime, text or phone, and then giving people a specific opportunity to have a voice and let them express their thoughts and concerns. Tom says, thank you notes, progress updates, sharing success stories and photos through the newsletter. And then Karen says that she's meeting with folks bi-monthly as a team. And then they also do service projects where people, where the people are located, and then also spread out through Michigan. And then they try to do something in each region. That's what it was. And Annette has an open door policy, not just for organizational matters, but also personal as well, which I think I did that a lot too. And that's, sometimes people just need that quiet time. And then Kate says they offer a yearly thank you appreciation award and then a volunteer of the year. So that's really nice. And then we have students who write thank you letters to our volunteers and donors. Oh, and then yeah. And so, so they've got all kinds of things here.
Yeah. So lots of recognition, lots of different things that we are doing to bring everybody into the fold, if you will. Right. Another idea is to make sure that when at meetings, we're brainstorming, we're letting people throw their suggestions out there and have some input. It's a great idea to do that. Something else when we are remote that I want to mention is the idea of making sure that we can see each other. It's very easy, and a lot of us tend to put our, we'll turn the microphone on so we can have a conversation, but the video may be off. And maybe it's because there's something in the background that we don't want people to see, or, the dogs and the children are running around. But I would encourage your people to have the cameras on. We're not concerned about the background. We want to see you. We want to see your face. We want you to see ours, and we want to feel like we're in the room together, even though it's a virtual Zoom room. So I would encourage everybody to use cameras as well as audio. And sometimes audio is what we do because that's what we need to do. And that's okay too. But if you encourage your people to do that, it does help with the engagement. Also, when we can see people, we see the nonverbals. Nonverbal communication, those are expressions. Those are, the eyebrows raise and the smiles come out, right? We can tell a lot from somebody's body language and posture. And so when we see them, we can have these cues. When we don't see them, we don't get the nonverbal cues. When we are talking about boosting our visibility, we want to make sure that not only do we have the time to meet with our people, but that our people feel comfortable accessing us, right? So you all threw out some amazing ways that you are keeping in contact with your people, right? You're doing check-ins, you're having meetings, we're doing all these wonderful things. And we want to make sure every time you do this, you are visible and your voice is also visible. And we talk a lot about voice in terms of our volunteers having a voice. And that is very important and critical. But at the same time, there's another voice in the room, and that's your voice. You have a voice throughout all your communications, and we don't always think about that. When we craft an email and we send it out to our teams and to our volunteers, if we're in a hurry, sometimes it might come off as just sounding a little bit terse or short. And we want to, a good rule of thumb to avoid that is to draft your email and then step away, do another activity, whatever you need to do, and then come back and take another look before you hit the send button. When you do that, you just have the chance to give it a fresh set of eyes and make sure it says what you want to say and that the reader is going to read it and hear the tone that you are using and what you are saying. It's important that you do that because when we are communicating via email or text, people are reading words and we're not hearing the voice. And when we don't hear the voice, we imagine what the voice is sounding like. We talked about, some of you mentioned keeping tabs on morale and some of the ways that you're doing this. And again, this is important. Why? Because I think COVID-19 has thrust us into sort of what I'm calling the era of humanity. Across the board, everybody recognizes that we are all people, regardless of what our role is. We are all people, and we're all dealing with physical issues. A lot of emotional, social issues are happening, and we need to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves and that we're checking in on our volunteers to make sure that they are doing okay. Well-being is one of those key words right now that everybody's talking about, and it's the whole person. It's not just somebody being sick or not sick. And so important that we keep checking in on our people. We can check in with pulse checks. We can check in by having one-on-ones and group meetings. That's a great way to do it. We can also check in using text, using email. There's a lot of different ways we can do this. We just want to make sure that we are. And, speaking of check-ins, let's remember we should be checking in on our colleagues and staff members as well. They're people too. And just to make sure that they're okay, we interact with them, we work together. It's a good idea to check in with them. And lastly, and honestly, most importantly, make sure you're checking in with yourself. We still need to be taking care of ourselves because we have a lot on our plates. Right now, the workload is pretty intense for everybody. And if you need to just take a minute or two and meditate, go for it. Whatever self-care looks like for you, just make sure you're doing it. That brings us to listening. Now, we've talked about listening already. It came up in the chat. And listening, I have lots to say about listening. Listening, I think, is one of the most underused forms of communication that we have. When we do our check-ins with people, what are we doing? We're listening. We're listening to them share with us how they are. And listening is really important and very, very key to a successful team. What do we listen to? Well, externally, outside of our teams, we need to listen to what's going on in our organizations, right? With our staff and colleagues and the organization itself, changes that are happening, what's going on in the community that might affect our volunteers or our programs, or how about globally? Do we have weather issues? What the pandemic obviously was a clear example of that. We need to be listening to what's happening outside of our teams so that we can address the impact on the inside. And inside within our teams, we need to be listening to our people. This brings us to the idea of feedback and how we listen. And we're going to touch base on that in just a little bit, but it's important that we not only listen to our people, but we give our people and our teammates and our volunteers the opportunity to share their thoughts. Okay. All of these are communication strategies that we need to be using to really have our teams be those strong teams that everybody wants to be on. Why is communication important? Why are we focusing on this today? We all know that communication keeps us in the loop, right? We know what communication does, but when we don't have communication, that's where we see what the benefits of communication really are. And by that, I mean, when we don't have communication, we have what I call the communication abyss, which is, think of it as if you fall into a deep, dark hole where nothing happens. Okay. So when we don't communicate, then our team members start asking questions because our teams are comprised of people. And what do we do as people? We don't like silence. We want to fill the empty space. So we start asking questions. We start trying to figure out what's going on. And 9 times out of 10, what we come up with is much worse than what's really happening. So we want to make sure we're constantly communicating with our people. Here's an example, so you can see what I'm talking about. I was working with a team, a high-level team. Great, one of those just amazingly strong cultures of a team. Incredible team leader, incredible team members. Everybody was a high performer, and they were nonprofit organization. They had a project assigned to them and they hit the ground running and they just charged down the road. And about a quarter to a third of the way through, leadership said, time out. We're going to have you go in a different direction. No problem. They just turned 90 degrees and kept right on going. They came in under budget, ahead of schedule, and put together a stellar report. All good. Team members were thrilled. Team leader was thrilled. Everybody was congratulating themselves on what a great job they had done. And nothing happened. They heard nothing from leadership. And so they fell into the communication abyss and they started asking themselves questions. Why haven't we heard anything? What's going on? Did we make a mistake? Did I do something wrong? Did we not, get the charge here? Did we totally miss the boat and mess up the project? Does leadership think that we are a lousy team? I mean, and it just went on down the path. This was very frustrating, very, very frustrating, especially to one team member who at that point said, you know what? I'm out of here. I'm done. I can't do this. I feel so disrespected. I feel so discouraged. And I've never been so disheartened in my whole lifetime of volunteering. Well, as it turned out, leadership did come back 2 weeks later with all the kudos and congratulations that you would have expected. You guys are great. It was such a wonderful job and the report was better than we expected, and et cetera, et cetera. But it was too late. It was too late for that volunteer. And it was really too late for the team because they felt very disrespected and ignored and undervalued. In fact, they felt not valued at all. So that's why it's important to not let your people make up the narrative. Keep them in the loop. Don't let them try and imagine what might be happening. Let them know. And then everybody's on the same page. When we don't communicate, there's pretty much a classic cycle that happens. First off, people get frustrated. And when we get frustrated, what do? We pull back. And so productivity starts to decrease. And what does that look like? Well, maybe it means your volunteer shows up late for a shift 3 times in a row, or somebody doesn't bother to show up at all and doesn't call, doesn't let you know. It could look like many different things, but whatever it is, it shifts the weight onto you and onto the other team members. That's not a good thing, because then morale starts to go down. And when morale goes down and people pull back and disengage, eventually we lose people. And without retention, we have no volunteer program. So we need to make sure that we are communicating throughout the entire volunteer life cycle, from recruitment and service all the way through to beyond. Beyond is after our volunteer leaves us. And this is important to think about. Communication doesn't stop when the volunteer says goodbye. Why? Because we know that our volunteers sometimes have to step away from a team for a variety of reasons. It could be that their life situation has changed. Maybe their work responsibilities don't give them time to volunteer anymore. Maybe, there's someone ill in the family and they have to take time to take care of them, or maybe they're just burnt out. But that doesn't mean that they don't want to come back. And we always want to leave the door open. We always want to offer our volunteers to keep them in the fold, in the family, so that if they want to come back, they can. And let's not forget that the other key thing to think about is that volunteers are donors. 80% of our volunteers are donors, right? So if we have a volunteer who may be a donor, maybe, a small donor, but then they need to step away from our team for whatever reason. Well, now maybe they can't contribute time, but they want to contribute more dollars. Maybe they want to become a community partner. Maybe they want to step into a different role because they've pretty much done what they could do on our team. Maybe they want to sit on the board. We never know. And so we want to make sure that we are communicating with our volunteers until they tell us to stop. So important. And don't forget, we need to communicate through periods of change. We need to communicate more through periods of change just because of what's going on. How do we communicate? We use our channels. What are communication channels? Those are the methods that we use to put the information out there. So what are some of the channels we use? Well, right now we're using Zoom to have this conversation. That's a communication channel. Email, right? We talked about the telephone. That's a communication channel. Social media, right? There are lots of different communication vehicles or channels that we can use. My recommendation is figure out which ones work for your volunteers, but also which ones work for you. If you're trying to maintain a channel and you're struggling with it, it's not going to support you and your volunteers. So figure out maybe just one or two that really work for you and your volunteers and stick with those. Your tried and true ways of reaching your volunteers. Maybe you have a portal. Volunteer portal, that's kind of like one-stop shopping, right? You can have your volunteers fill out the application in the portal. You can post opportunities there. You can put training videos up there. You can have your volunteers track their hours, and they usually have a communication piece in that platform where you can directly communicate with your volunteers and then they can communicate back to you. You may not have a portal. That's okay. There are plenty of other ways to communicate that work very well. And what works for you and your volunteers may not work for somebody else. That's okay. Why? Because no two volunteer teams are alike and no two organizations are alike. One thing I just want to toss out there with social media. Social media is quick. It's easy. We like social media. But we need to remember that social media, first off, is public. And once you put something out there, it's out there. So we need to be careful with what type of information we share on social media and how we communicate on social. The other thing to remember with social media is that it's a conversation. Social media is two-way. We can make a post and, we can post something on Facebook and then somebody's going to respond. And if we can't respond back and maintain that conversation, then what happens? They go back to the abyss, right? So we want to make sure if we're using a social media channel to communicate with our volunteers, that we can maintain it or that we have someone who will maintain it for us. Okay. I've done a lot of talking. Let's hear from you. How are you communicating with your volunteers? We've given you some choices. And some of these may be vehicles that you're using. You can choose any of them, a combination of the above, or if you're doing something else, other. And again, use the chat, please. Let us know what else you are doing. I think we all can come up with new ideas and suggestions just by knowing what everybody else is doing. So Melissa, do we have the poll for this?
We do. Let's see.
Okay.
I think it is this one. How about I launch it here?
Okay, there it is. So the poll has been launched. So please choose what works for you and let us know. Looks like a lot of us are doing a combination, which is really
Yeah.
great. Email, we're using email. About a quarter of us are using email. And Melissa, can people choose more than one answer on this poll?
Oh, you know what? I don't think they can. I
Okay.
think single choice. But
Okay.
people have been putting some cool things in the chat.
Yeah.
He
So-
says text, MailChimp, email,
Mhm.
Zoom. And then what was the other one that was up here? It was really cool. I've heard GroupMe or WhatsApp app for internet partners. That's
Right. So I'm going to stop the poll because it looks like we're pretty much at the end, and I'm going to share this so everybody can see what we've said. 10% of us are doing something else, and you've already shared with us some of what they're doing, which I think is great. Teams is another thing that a lot of organizations use. Look how many of us are emailing. 20% of us are emailing,
yeah.
and 6% of us are having in-person meetings. Now, we said in-person or virtual on the poll, so I'm not sure if that means in-person or both, but at any rate, most of us are using a combination, which is exactly what we should be doing. If you think about it, people have different, we know that people have different learning styles. People also have different absorption styles and listening styles. So when we can communicate in a couple different ways, that helps us get our messages out much more effectively. So great job, everyone, on that. Absolutely wonderful.
It is interesting how we've moved away from printed newsletters and communication boards. Yeah.
And yet they keep coming back. It's interesting.
Yeah,
It's interesting. Things can go in cycles. So, speaking of those different types of vehicles, what kind of information should we be sharing? Well, for me, I kind of boil it down to 3 different questions. Number 1, what do you need your volunteers to know? What information do you need to share with your volunteers? Number 2, what do your volunteers need to know? What's important to them? A lot of times what we think is important from maybe an organizational perspective or a volunteer engagement perspective may not be what our volunteers are looking to know. So we need to find out. And what are the key messages of the organization? What we need to do is make sure that what we say and what we communicate about aligns with what the organization is doing and saying. When we send out confusing, conflicting messaging, our volunteers don't know what to do. So we want to make sure that there's nothing more frustrating than hearing one thing inside your team from your team leader. Well, here's what's happening. And then hearing from leadership something totally the opposite. So we want to make sure that we are aligning. And of course, that we're always tying back to the mission. When we are remote, we especially need to do this on a regular basis, right? So having a schedule is very, very helpful, especially when we're dealing with remote. Again, because we don't have that luxury of just walking into a room. We have to set up a time for us to meet or send out a communication. At the same time, we want to make sure we're using two-way communication. We're not just pushing information out from team leader to the team, but that the team has the ability to communicate back. And this leads us into the idea of feedback. And this came up already before. So I'm going to ask you to share with us how you are getting feedback from your people. And while you do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about feedback, and then we're going to pull those answers in, okay? So feedback is feedback is two-way. And we have feedback going from the giver to the receiver. Here's what feedback is not. Feedback is not a critique. Feedback is not an attack. And many times people are uncomfortable with constructive feedback because that's where we're working with a volunteer to perhaps change a behavior or let them know that we're moving in a different direction, whatever it is. So feedback has two sides, and we need to always make sure that we're thinking about both sides. What feedback is it's really useful learning tool for both the receiver and the giver. Now, feedback comes in many different forms, right? We have basic feedback. Hey, how's it going? It's going great. Everything good? Yep, I'm fine. Okay, that's a simple conversation, but you're getting some feedback from people. Feedback can seem uncomfortable. That's that constructive feedback, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But feedback also comes in other forms. Recognition is feedback. Think about it. When we recognize our people, what are we doing? We're saying, great job. You did a wonderful thing. And not only are we telling this to our volunteer, but usually we do this in a public venue. So we congratulate them at a meeting or at an award ceremony or in the newsletter, right? So when we do this, we are acknowledging our volunteer, giving them feedback. You're doing things in a wonderful way, and we so appreciate you, but we're also letting everybody else hear that feedback and letting everybody else know how much we value the people on our team. So it's very important that we use this during recognition. Recognition is wonderful. When we're virtual, we have to think about how we can provide feedback, giving and getting feedback from our people. So let's talk about constructive feedback for a second. Constructive feedback is, first of all, it's not personal. It's not about the person. It feels personal to people when someone is sharing with them something that they would like to see different. Okay, so how do we deal with this? What do we do? Well, the best way is to, aside from being direct, being calm, keeping your voice calm, is sitting down with your volunteer to have the conversation. I recommend set a meeting time, set a time to do this for just the two of you so that there's not interruptions and you can focus on having this conversation. And we want to keep the conversation about the behavior, about here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I've observed. I'm seeing that you've been showing up late to your shifts. And number one, I just want to check in and see if everything's okay with you. Number two, can you share with me why we're having this issue with lateness? Is this maybe not a good time for you anymore? Should we try and reschedule? Let me know what's happening, right? So you're opening the door to that conversation in a non-threatening way. You are explaining to your volunteer what's happening, what you are seeing, which means you're not saying, here's what you are doing, but this is what I am observing. This is what I see, which takes it out of the personal and into the behavior. And then we want to connect what we're doing. So we need to explain what happens. What happens when we're late to shifts? Well, it throws everybody off and our clients are not served in the way that we need to be serving them. So let's come up with a solution, right? And you have that conversation. When we have it as a two-way dialogue, first of all, we achieve results. And second of all, the volunteer doesn't feel trod upon, like everything's being pushed on them, because we need feedback. We need to know why this is happening, and let's together come up with a solution. In terms of giving constructive feedback, a lot of people are not comfortable with this idea. So here's something you can try. I love to do a role play. And when you role play, what you're doing is you ask a trusted colleague to sit down with you and you literally have the conversation. You be yourself, you be the VEP, the volunteer engagement professional. Your colleague will sit in as the volunteer and you have the conversation. This gives you a chance to actually say the words, hear how they come out, think about what you're going to say and what the volunteer says back to you. So you can go through the entire conversation. Once you're done with that, you're going to flip roles. So now you are the volunteer and your colleague is you, the VEP, and you go through the role play again. And when you do this, you have the chance to step into the volunteer's shoes and hear the conversation from the volunteer's perspective. When you do this, it may change some of the things that you say, or you may think about phrasing things differently. Even if you don't, you'll have a better appreciation for what your volunteer might be feeling when you have this conversation. Role play is a really, really terrific way to prepare to have an uncomfortable conversation. So that's giving feedback, but let's talk about getting feedback because that's important too. As a VEP, volunteer engagement professional, right? We need feedback. We need feedback on how things are going. We need feedback from our volunteers. Our volunteers, if they're working with clients, they're boots on the ground, right? They're right in the heart of the project or the process or the activity, and they can tell us how it's going. They can tell us what they see, if they see issues that we need to think about addressing, if they have concerns or questions, if they see things that are going great. I mean, feedback is positive too, right? We want all of it. So how do we get that feedback? Melissa, I'm going to turn it to you. How are we asking for feedback from our people? What are people saying?
Yeah, they had some great ideas. Surveys is one,
Uh-huh.
polls, phone conversations, and email. And then in terms of having that conversation, giving them the chance to pick somewhere they're comfortable so that they can share their voice. I thought that was great.
Yes.
Thing that I used to do at the hospital is we would really focus on being our staff, our team would focus on being very present to the volunteers. So we purposeful rounding, and we would have information that we would want to make sure that we shared, and then we also tracked what we were hearing back. So if they said, hey, you know what, we're constantly running out of hand towels in the bathroom, it sounds like maybe a minor thing, but not really when you're in a hospital.
Right.
Or whatever, and so we were able to track these things, and we were able to solve a lot of these things that might be minor. We might view them as minor inconveniences, but for the volunteers, they were kind of ongoing major issues for them. So because they were hearing from people, it didn't feel good. So we did a lot of that.
Well,
but and I love the ideas of the surveys and things too. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was going to say the key here is that you asked your volunteers, who ask for feedback, and that's what we all need to be doing. Some of our volunteers are very comfortable giving us feedback without being asked, right? Maybe we have a suggestion box and they'll drop suggestions in, they'll drop comments in. Some of our volunteers are not comfortable with that. We need to hear from everybody. So asking is what we need to do. And we can ask by sending out a survey, right? We can ask by sitting down and having a conversation with a direct ask. There's many ways we can ask, but it's important that we do ask. And it's important that we ask for feedback all the way around, from, as you said, Melissa, from small things that may be considered minor inconveniences, like not having enough towels in the bathroom, to bigger picture concerns and situations. I think it's also a good idea to get feedback, 360-degree feedback, which means not just feedback from your volunteers, but also from your colleagues and your staff, and then from up above, from leadership or management. This is a great way to find out how your program is being perceived, how your volunteers are perceived within the organization in terms of strategically thinking about volunteer engagement. And it's also a great way to find out how you are doing in terms of your personal performance. So feedback is helpful in so many different ways. So how do we respond to feedback? Because when we ask for feedback and we get it, then we have to take it to the next step. We need to respond, right? So what do? I'm curious. So use the chat, please, and tell us how you respond to feedback. And there's many different ways we respond. We know when we are providing feedback to our volunteers, we know how they respond. How do we respond? And what do we do with it? When a volunteer gives us feedback in terms of maybe a suggestion, what do we do with that? Well, sometimes it's a great idea that we can just implement right away. Sometimes it's an idea that is something really cool to think about, and we may not be able to use it right now. So what do? Well, we send a quick note. Hey, John, thanks so much for submitting that wonderful idea. While we don't have the resources to implement this right now, when the budget cycles around again, this is definitely going to be on the table, right? Let them know how you feel about it. Now, what if a volunteer makes a suggestion that is just not going to work? For whatever reasons, it's not going to work for you or your program, or maybe even your organization. And sometimes that happens. What do? Well, you don't have to act on every suggestion. that your volunteers give. But what we do need to do is acknowledge it. We need to acknowledge receipt of the message. Let your volunteer know that her voice was heard. I got your message. So what do we do? How do we do that? Well, it can be just a quick note, hey, Sherry, thanks so much for your suggestion. Really appreciate that you took the time to send in your thoughts to me. You've given me a lot to think about. Something like that, non-committal, but you're acknowledging that your volunteer has valuable time and she took the time to share her thoughts, and you're letting her know that you actually read the message or heard the message, however it was delivered, and that you appreciate it. This goes a long way toward keeping your team cohesive, keeping your volunteers feeling good. I mean, we all know sometimes we make suggestions and they're just not applicable. That's okay. So we need to let our people know that. But always, we have to respond to the feedback. So Melissa, what are people saying? How do we respond to feedback?
Well, I think this team is doing great here. Yeah.
Yeah, you guys are coming up with some amazing things.
They really are. So Carol says, in her situation, she's always looking for feedback from the community that she's working with. And Peggy says, always be respectful and listen until they're done sharing. I think that's really important. And I would take it a step further. I had a learning and organization development person who would always say, now let me make sure what I heard was right. And he would repeat it back and paraphrase it, but I always thought that was very powerful. Kate said, thank the volunteer for their info, then talk with the management about concerns, then implement change if needed. And Joshua says something really good here too. You have to be careful, as you might come off as passive aggressive or on accident or belittling. And I would just say, I would try to, I know that can happen, and you don't want that. You certainly don't want that to happen. And then Annette says, think about what you said, repeat what you heard. Oh yeah. Yep. And talk about it openly. Yes. Repeating you hear is key. Yeah. Isn't this group great? They're like for the curve. They've got it.
Yes. Well, and it's so true. When you repeat something back, what you're doing is you're getting confirmation, right? You're confirming with your volunteer, this is what you said. And you do it as, this is what I heard you say, ... And then your volunteer has the opportunity to say, yes, that's exactly what I meant. Or that's not quite what I was saying. Let me rephrase it, right? So you can make sure that you're understanding what they're saying. I agree. That is so, so important. And again, when you do that, you are validating your volunteer. And that's critical. All these things we're talking about, these communication strategies are helping us to keep our teams moving forward, right? We are always looking at the end goal, checking where we're at, and making sure that everyone is with us every step of the way. However, sometimes things come at us and we have to deal with change. Sometimes the rug is pulled right out from underneath us, like it was with COVID-19. And then what do we do? Well, it helps if we have a plan, a communication plan, a change plan. And, before COVID-19, not everybody had one of these. Now that we've 2 years in, you pretty much have a template that you can use going forward for addressing change in terms of your communication because of what you've already had to do and what you've been doing during COVID-19. The one thing that's important to remember is, as the kitten says, hope is not a strategy. We cannot communicate by thinking that the communication is going to fall out of the sky. We have to be prepared because we never know when change is going to come. And we need to make sure that when it does come, and we have to communicate immediately with our people for safety reasons, or, because a situation has dramatically changed, number one, that we know what we're going to say. And number two, that we have the ability to do that. So we have our channels in place, we can reach them, and we know that they will be able to hear the messages that we need to share. So, so important. What we need to do is, when we think about a change plan, a change communication plan, we have to prioritize. And we may have a lot of prioritizing to do, and a lot of things that are important. Our people are extremely important to us, right? Providing up to the moment information, keeping everybody on top of things so that as change happens very quickly, and as things change, we're letting everybody know as soon as we possibly can, right? How do we do that? We use updates, we use surveys, we have our conversations, we have our meetings, lots of different ways, emails, texts, right? Whatever our channels are. But it's really important that we do that. And we also need to think about what it is that we're sharing. There's a difference between need to have information, which is you need to know about our COVID-19 protocols. That's a need to know, right? Our regulations are changing. Need to know. A nice to know or a nice to have information is something that may be important, but not quite at that same level. So it's different for every organization. It's different for every team, but we need to think about what are the important things that we need to prioritize and share with our people. When we have to change, as we said, change happens fast. So we use the channels that we have, that we're comfortable with, and that everybody can access, hopefully, but we also sometimes need to get a little extra help. And where do we go? Well, how about your volunteers? You have volunteers in your bank of volunteers who have the ability and the capabilities to help you out. You have communication volunteers. You have people who can write. If you need help, drafting something, if you need help spreading the word, how about asking your team leaders to reach out individually to their teams and help you spread the word that way? You have at your fingertips a lot of different ways that you can actually quickly and effectively get your messages out there. Some of them that we haven't even thought about yet, like tapping our people. We also want to think about how often we are putting our messages out there during change. When COVID first hit, everybody was communicating as much as they possibly could because everything was changing so fast, right? And then eventually people said they started to have overload, Zoom fatigue from too many meetings, and information overload because I'm getting so many emails, I can't read them all in my box. You need to decide what's an appropriate cadence for you. And again, that's dependent on you, your organization, and the messaging you have to share with your volunteers. But whatever it is, make sure that you're comfortable with it and that it works and that you are ready to go. By creating a change communication plan, we're thinking through ahead of time what we would do if we hit a situation where we need to react quickly and pivot, right? Like COVID-19. So when you're prepared to do this, it's much, much easier to make it happen in a very quick way. Another type of change that we hit is when a project is it ends and the cycle is complete, right? So what happens? Do we just stop and say, okay, guys, great job. Thanks so much? No. Why? Because our teams need closure. They need to see the full cycle. They need to understand the impact and the outcomes of the great work that they did. So what I like to do is I like to sit down and do what I call a post-mortem. And we sit down as a team and we talk about how things went. We talk about what we did that went beautifully and how it worked well, why it worked well. And we talk about the challenges that we had, maybe what we did to overcome them and what we might do in the future when we do this project again. When we have a chance to have these conversations, we're letting our people give us suggestions, right? So they're providing feedback. We're also letting them have their voices heard and share their thoughts, which is so important. At the same time, we're getting new ideas. We're brainstorming. We're coming up with creative, innovative ways to take the project to the next level. All great things to do. And when we do this, and we can all come together as a unit and say, hey, we did a really nice job on this project. We can feel good about what we did and feel good about working together. That keeps the trust and the bonding of your team tight. Great way to do this is along the way, documenting progress. How do we do that? With metrics. We talk about metrics all the time. right? We all understand why metrics are important for our leadership and management, why they need to hear about our metrics, why metrics are important to our programs, but we also need to think about sharing those metrics with our volunteers and our people, because when we share the milestones, when we hit a milestone and then we move on, that's a success. We can motivate our people by sharing those successes along the way. It also helps us gauge our progress and know where we're at. And that's very important too. We're always looking at finishing the project, hitting the end goal, whatever our targets are, right? But we want to make sure that we're keeping our people with us along the way and not just waiting until the end to share all the results. So share what you can along the way. And there may be some that you can't, you have to hold back for whatever reasons. Something else to keep your teams moving forward is recognition. We've touched on that quite a few times today, but have you thought about putting together an annual recognition plan? This is where you actually lay out how you are going to communicate about recognition over the course of a year. When we do something like this, it gives us some breathing room. We're not scrambling to recognize our people every, all the time, because we've got it planned out. You may already have something like this or some pieces that are already part of a plan, right? Maybe at the end of the year, you do an annual recognition for your volunteers. And maybe on a monthly basis, you do service awards, right? These things may be things that you're doing already, but what about in between? How are we recognizing, communicating about our recognition in between? Well, maybe on a weekly basis at our meetings or bi-weekly meetings, we give a shout out to someone who's done a great job, or a team that's done a really nice job on their project or gotten some client feedback that, hey, they are wonderful, right? Lots of things that we have to communicate. But my rule of thumb with recognition is thank your people 7 times in 7 different ways. And everybody says to me, Karen, that's a lot. If I take that and multiply it by all my volunteers, you're asking an awful lot of me. But if you break it down and you lay out your annual recognition plan, you'll see that acknowledging someone 7 times throughout the course of the year is really quite easy to do. Maybe you, at the end of the year in that annual recognition, you're acknowledging all your volunteers. That counts as 1. Maybe something as simple as saying thank you individually to the person. That's 2. That's another way of recognizing someone, right? Then we have all of our other various forms of recognition. When you lay it out, you also have the opportunity to think about recognizing everyone who needs to be recognized. Sometimes it's not just our volunteers that we should recognize, but our colleagues and staff, or perhaps even supervisors, our volunteer supervisors. They need to be recognized too. So we have the chance to really think it through, and then our recognition is taken up to the next level. And lastly, speaking of going up to the next level, succession planning. When we all know that on teams, people need to step off at one point or another, and it could be for various reasons. It might be that someone's term is ending, right? Their time on the team is ending. Maybe somebody is the chair of a committee, and now that term is up. Well, we need somebody to fill the spot. How do we do that? We have succession. When we have a succession plan and we're able to communicate it to everyone, it helps us along in so many ways. First of all, it helps us fill the spot, right? Second of all, it lets everybody know, hey, there's a spot that's going to be available. If you're interested, here's some information about it. And what kind of information do we share about succession? Well, we let people know the process. We communicate, here's our process. Here's how it goes. Here's the timeline. If you are interested in submitting to be the chair or a vice chair, right? Or whatever position you have, here's what you need to do. We have an application. Please fill out the application. It's very short, and submit it by March 1st. And then from March 1st until April 1st, the nominating committee will review the applications. They'll make some selections and they will do some interviewing, and then they will make their recommendations. Letting everybody know the timeline goes a long way towards people feeling comfortable with the idea of throwing their hat in the ring. And that helps us fill the spots. It also helps our teams deal with gaps. When we have a succession plan in place and somebody has to step out for an emergency or just before their term is up or for whatever reason, we have a backup. We have someone who's able to transition in, and it's a much smoother transition. Otherwise, what happens when we have a gap? Everybody has to pitch in, carry a heavier load until we can sort it out. So communicating about succession planning is very, very key. And a lot of times we don't think about that in terms of our volunteer teams. We don't think about communicating that process. Super important that we do that. Okay, I have thrown a lot of information at you. We've talked about a lot, and you have given me some really wonderful feedback and suggestions. Before we pause for the Q&A, let's just kind of sum it up. And really, if we think about it, an informed team member is a productive team member, a happy team member, and an engaged team member, really. We talked about communication. We talked about developing a plan, how we communicate, structuring that. We talked about how we can engage our people, help them gain some professional development through communicating about it. We talked about getting feedback from our people and making sure that we're using the 3 C's of content, thinking about what we say, right? Content, channels, thinking about how we share that information, and also cadence, how often we communicate with our people. And we talked about communicating through change and different ways that we can elevate our teams even further using some different communication strategies. Before I turn things over to Melissa, I just want to touch again one more time on the idea of thank you. Those 2 words, thank you, they may be small size words, but they mean something huge. And many times we forget to say thank you. In the heat of the moment, when things are hectic and things are crazy, sometimes we do forget. And the people that we forget to thank are those who are in the trenches day to day, those who are inspiring us and mentoring us and guiding us and keeping us moving forward. And who am I talking about? I'm talking about you. All of you, our volunteer engagement professionals, you are the glue that keeps our organizations moving forward. You are doing such amazing work, such great work. And oftentimes we forget to tell you that. And so on behalf of your volunteers and your staff and colleagues and your organizations and even the larger community, I would like to take the time to say a personal thank you to each and every one of you for everything that you are doing. We truly couldn't do it without you. You are treasures and you are so, so very much appreciated. So thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, Melissa,
All
let's
right.
pause and see if we have any other questions that people would like to have answered.
Let's see what we have. What other
Okay.
questions do you have? You know, we have an expert here with us. By the way, we had a compliment that you're a wonderful presenter, that this has been a great presentation so far.
Oh, well, thank you.
So what are your other questions?
And we may have answered a lot along the way. And that's okay too if we did, but
that is
happy to answer more.
And, you know, I will say that there are times when communication can be tough. And
Sure.
Karen mentioned this. She talked about when you're in crisis, you know, when I remember when COVID first happened, and I was in a place where we really weren't supposed to be communicating that much out of the organization. And it was put me in a tough place. I still remember that kind of very uncomfortableness, because that's just not the way we always were. So that was an interesting position to be in. But generally, I think that there's always a balance between giving too much information and not enough. You know, on one hand,
Yes.
people to to understand what's happening, but on the other hand, you don't want to inundate them with too much. So, and having the different ways to do that, whether it's, a touch base, an email, talking with someone, involving them, I think that that's wonderful. Karen also talked about the 7 different ways, recognizing and communicating with people, 7 different ways, right?
7 ways to say thank you. Thanking your
Yes.
people in 7 ways, 7 times. Yes.
Oh gosh, I thought that was terrific. We do have, we have a couple of things here. Kate says, we have many different areas to work in. Her gallery crew versus her events needs. Do each of these require different amounts of communication with volunteers for each of these? Well, wouldn't you think that they may need different amounts of information? One size doesn't fit all.
Right. Absolutely. When when you're talking about an event and you have different teams for that event, right? Like the gallery team. Yeah, depending on what they're doing and the timeline that they're working in, you may need to connect with one team more at a certain point in time, like upfront. I'm working with the team right now that's planning an event, and the production team of volunteers is, that's further down the line. They get together, they focus on the production, not at the very beginning. At the very beginning, it's the planning committee. So yes, you absolutely may need to touch base with your teams at different times. The main thing to remember as far as communicating is, as Melissa mentioned, it's a balancing act of how much information to share, but making sure that you are sharing something. So if your individual teams are on a bigger team, the bigger event team, then we just want to make sure periodically we're getting that team together or sending out a communication so that everybody on the team knows what's happening. That way questions don't come up and people don't end up tripping on each other.
Absolutely. And then just so everyone knows, they're asking a lot of questions about getting the video recording and seeing the slides again. And yes, everyone. We also have a handout that's going to be coming out as well. And we just had a little trouble putting it in the chat, a link to it. So I try to follow up with some information just to keep you going and keep you thinking about this. We don't want this to be a one and done. We want you to give some thought to how you can improve your own communications. And even though I did a lot of communications with folks, I always felt like I needed help and improvement. So whenever I had these opportunities, I always appreciated it. One of the things that Kate said is, I feel like we're leaving a lot of people out and they're losing interest. Is that, Kate, is that losing interest in volunteerism? Is that losing interest in your organization? How is that working?
Sounds like that's an engagement question. Yes, I'd love to hear more about how that's happening.
I'm unmuted. So what I'm saying is that, so we have events, education, and gallery crew, and each one of those uses a different amount of volunteers at a different amount of time.
Right.
And because we have certain volunteers that like to work in one area versus another, how do we keep them engaged throughout the year when we're not needing to use them until, say, our benefit or our auction, which only happens once a year? So how do we keep these people engaged, knowing that we still appreciate them and we want them to come back?
That is an excellent question. And I'm so glad that you asked that, because when we have a team that works on an annual event, like your auction, right? Their time to come together and really do the work happens at a certain point in the year. So yes, absolutely. The question is, well, how do we keep them connected for the other 3/4 of the year so that they will come back next year and maybe they'll bring some additional volunteers, right? They'll help us with recruiting. So we communicate, we make sure that when we communicate with all of our volunteers, we include them. We put their names in our emails, in our email group lists, and we keep them up to date with what's happening in the organization as well as in the volunteer program. This has the impact of, number one, making them feel valued and appreciated giving them additional information so they can see what's happening. They see the bigger picture of how their event has impacted the organization and the mission, right? Because once the event is over, then we get the results, the impact and the outcomes from that event. So sharing that as well. Maybe think about, depending in how your cycle works, maybe doing a spotlight on that team or on one of the teams, or even an individual if you want, and putting that out in the summer. If your event happens in the fall, then you can use it to help you recruit and to help people start thinking about the auction, right? Maybe it's getting everyone together at the end of the year. Let's say, I don't know what your cycle is. Let's say your event happens in the summer. Maybe around the holidays, it's making sure to send a holiday card or a holiday thank you to everyone on that team. So you're having touch points throughout the year. It's not every day, but that's fine. But you've got certain touch points throughout the year where you are keeping your volunteer in the loop. That's the same idea. We talked about communicating through the entire cycle. It's making sure to just kind of stay top of mind periodically so that when it comes time for them to come back, they are ready to roll.
Rachel had an interesting question here. She said, is it possible to over communicate? And I think it is, but she has some heavy hitter volunteers. Should she bundle the opportunities into one email, phone call, or reach out a few different times? What do you think?
I think it depends on what your goals are. If you are trying to recruit a certain number of volunteers and say sending out an email doesn't get you that number of volunteers, then you need to try some other communication methods for recruiting. If you are wanting to reach your volunteers in different ways because you're not sure everybody's getting the messages, then yeah, absolutely, we want to try some different channels. So I think it goes back to your goals and what you're trying to achieve, who you're trying to reach, and what you're trying to say.
I think that's great advice. Would it be okay while we're taking questions if I could launch a poll? One of the goals that we have is to make sure that we've increased learning. And I just have a final poll here, if that's all right with everyone.
Sure. And in fact, why don't I stop sharing my screen so you can pull the poll up? Do you want me to do that?
Okay, that sounds great. Let me see if I can get that poll up here.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, there's the results from that one. Okay. Huh. Oh, I'm not seeing that poll up here. You know what I will do? I will see if I can launch that poll later and we can set something out to everyone. I think one of the things that we're going to do for everyone here is we will send out all of this information along with the handout. So yeah, well, continue your questions. We have a little bit more time, a couple minutes more time if you'd like.
I have a question, or actually I wanted to thank you, Karen, for a really great presentation. And also, Kate, you're the person who said you have a
Hi,
yearly.
Jessica, please. She said extension 220.
Oh,
Thank you.
Joanne, could you mute yourself, please?
Oh, Carol Pfeffercorn.
Oh, no. Go ahead with your question, Carol.
Oh, it actually is a comment. This has been so helpful, especially Kate's involvement a few minutes ago when she talked about her yearly auction, because I'm on the board of a Friends of a Local Library, and we have a humongous book sale of used books once a year. And as a matter of fact, this year it will be for the last 2 years because of the pandemic. We didn't have last year. So we're going to have a very large book sale, and we now need new and younger volunteers, and this has given me some really good ideas.
Great.
Yeah, those book sales are amazing. If you knew how many books I have added from the book sales, the library book sales. That's a great way to involve. If you're looking for younger volunteers, that's a great way to involve the schools. the high schools maybe.
Well, sometimes
Yeah.
the students aren't really allowed to volunteer,
Mm.
but
Okay,
their parents do.
sure. There's
Oh,
lots of ways that you can do outreach to gain some new volunteers, and ask your current volunteers to help you recruit. That's always a great idea because our volunteers are connected all over and they have friends, and everybody wants their, everybody wants their friends to come and participate in something they're enjoying in. So I always found success asking my volunteers to help recruit.
Right, great. Thank you very much.
Sure.
well, thank you, everyone. If there are more that you'd like to ask about, feel free. I think we'll stay on for a few minutes, but I wanted to say thank you and let you know that we will send out the information following the presentation. It'll probably take me a day or so just to kind of get everything together, but I'll email it out to the entire group so that you have the slides, the recording, and the handout. And then we'll just do that little evaluation if you don't mind. Really appreciate it. We also do have some future trainings coming up. We have 2 that are in February. And then I don't know how many people joined us for the grant writing for nonprofits, but we will have a session, like a network session on that on September, or I'm sorry, wow, I'm really thinking ahead here, February 17th. And I'll send out the details for that as well. So if you missed it, you can follow along on that nonprofit grant writing training. You can listen to that, and then you can join us there if you'd like. And like I said, every month we'll have a couple of these. So we're really just delighted to have people join us. And I'm so impressed that with all the questions that you've had, I'm so impressed with all that you've been doing. And it just warms my heart that, in the middle of this pandemic, we have had so many hardworking volunteers continuing the good work and of agencies, and they've been supported by wonderful, caring people such as yourselves. So thank you.
You all are amazing.
You are.
Yes.
So yeah, so I will send that out on the grant writing too. Absolutely. Oh, well, thank you, everyone. And we'll wrap this up. Both Karen and I will stay around for a couple of minutes if you want to chat with us. But other than that, we just hope that you enjoy your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was such a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for all the great input and amazing questions. This has been just a delightful afternoon for me.